Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Grandmaster Knockout. In the left corner, the one, the only, Erigaisi. And his opponent, ladies and gentlemen, Niemann. Tonight, one board, 64 squares, playing white, Erigaisi. Playing black, Niemann. Gentlemen, let the battle begin. Erigaisi, knight to f3. Niemann, knight to f6. Erigaisi, pawn to c4. Niemann, pawn to c5. Erigaisi, knight to c3. Niemann, knight to c6. Erigaisi, pawn to d4. Niemann, pawn takes d4. Erigaisi, knight takes d4. Niemann, pawn to e6. Erigaisi, bishop to ff4. Niemann, pawn to d5. Erigaisi, pawn takes d5. Niemann, knight takes d5. Erigaisi, knight takes c6. Niemann, pawn takes c6. Erigaisi, bishop to d2. Niemann, bishop to b4. Erigaisi, pawn to a3. Niemann, bishop takes c3. Erigaisi, pawn takes c3. Niemann, castles kingside. Erigaisi, pawn to e4. Niemann, knight to f6. Erigaisi, queen to c2. Niemann, pawn to e5. Erigaisi, bishop to e2. Niemann, bishop to e6. Erigaisi, bishop to e3. Niemann, queen to a5. Erigaisi, castles kingside. Niemann, rook to ab8. Erigaisi, pawn to c4. Niemann, rook to fd8. Erigaisi, pawn to h3. Niemann, pawn to h6. Erigaisi, rook to fc1. Niemann, rook to d7. Erigaisi, bishop to d3. Niemann, knight to h5. Erigaisi, queen to c3. Niemann, queen takes c3. Erigaisi, rook takes c3. Niemann, knight to f4. Erigaisi, bishop to f1. Niemann, rook to b2. Erigaisi, rook to e1. Niemann, pawn to a5. Erigaisi, king to h2. Niemann, pawn to g5. Erigaisi, pawn to g3. Niemann, knight to h5. Erigaisi, bishop to d3. Niemann, knight to f6. Erigaisi, bishop to c2. Niemann, rook to d4. Erigaisi, bishop to c1. Niemann, rook to b7. Erigaisi, pawn to c5. Niemann, knight to d7. Erigaisi, bishop to e3. Niemann, rook to b2. Erigaisi, rook to b1. Niemann, rook takes c2. Erigaisi, rook takes c2. Niemann, rook takes a fort. Erigaisi, rook to d2. Niemann, knight to f6. Erigaisi, rook to d6. Niemann, knight to d5. Erigaisi, rook to e1. Niemann, knight to e7. Erigaisi, bishop to d2. Niemann, rook to a4. Erigaisi, bishop to c3. Niemann, pawn to e4. Erigaisi, bishop to f6. Niemann, knight to d5. Erigaisi, bishop to b2. Niemann, pawn to e3. Erigaisi, pawn takes a 3. Niemann, rook to c4. Erigaisi, rook to d8, check. Niemann, king to h7. Erigaisi, rook to h8, check. Niemann, king to g6. Erigaisi, rook to g8, check. Niemann, king to h5. Erigaisi, rook to e2. Niemann, knight takes a 3. Erigaisi, rook takes a 3. Niemann, rook to c2, check. Erigaisi, king to g1. Niemann, rook takes b2. Erigaisi, pawn to g4, check. Niemann, bishop takes g4. Erigaisi, pawn takes g4, check. Niemann, king takes g4. Erigaisi, rook to c8. Niemann, rook to c2. Erigaisi, rook takes c6. Niemann, pawn to h5. Erigaisi, rook to f6. Niemann, rook to c1, check. Erigaisi, king to g2. Niemann, pawn to h4. Erigaisi, rook to e4, check. Niemann, king to h5. Erigaisi, pawn to c6. Niemann, rook to c2, check. Erigaisi, king to g1. Niemann, pawn to h3. Erigaisi, rook takes f7. Niemann, pawn to g4. Erigaisi, rook to h7, check. Erigaisi lands the knockout. Niemann has no answer. If you loved this fight, smash that like button and subscribe. More legendary battles are coming your way. See you in the next one.